Hi guys, my name is Aindri
And I'm Mehak.
and welcome to another episode of All About That Reef. So today's topic is mainly about corals because our guest is very well versed in corals and coral conservation. So tell us a bit about corals, Mehak, or what you know about corals.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know a lot. But what I do know and what I think is general knowledge, but still a lot of people forget, is that corals actually live animals. They, despite the fact that they can't move, the coral polyp itself is like living and breathing, and it forms
And they feed as well.
and they feed, and they have symbiotic relationships with other organisms. And so while it is sort of an ecosystem, which is what we see, it's also built up of small individual polyps that then build these ecosystems up. So what's really cool about corals is they're actually known as ecosystem engineers, and they're also pioneer species, which means that once they attach and they come to a space, they create habitats for the species, and they
and create like this reef, so reef builders as well.
reef builders, and they engineer the ecosystem. So a lot of ecosystem services depend on corals.
And you were quite right.
Thank you, Andri.
Yeah, so everyone talks about how corals are actually animals and they're live organisms. Actually, one of my dreams is to see a coral spawning event. Those look so cool, and like the videos.
It looks really.
Yeah, and it happens once every, I think during a full moon.
Yeah, during full moons, but it's pretty sporadic, so I don't think you can like predict when
yeah,
it's
you
gonna
cannot,
happen.
and
So you
that's
just have
what's
to be
cool about it.
really lucky.
And
they're spawning like hundreds and millions, right?
It's
so
like it looks magical, like all of these like.
Actually, this is really random, but I just remembered that during my masters, that actually we looked at coral larvae. So one of the labs that I worked in, we would look like study the coral and then see when it like creates eggs, and then you make like small little slits and collect the eggs, and then we would actually, and like they're really just like really small
and intricate, like it has such like detailed.
Yeah, and it was really cool because then we put like the eggs in like a thing, and then we put some other dark corals, and then we like watched it. I mean, I didn't see it spawn, but it was like really cool because they're really so small and so like really small. And like what you don't realize is when you see these big ecosystems and like massive structures, is that at some point they just started off as this one tiny organism, like a few cells, right? And like they're so cute also because when you like put like shrimp and like brine, all these things, like have them feed, and then suddenly you see like its polyps extend out, and then they like come to like catch the food. So it was really like you really do see it as an organism, as an individual there. Which
so
is really
actually some of the dives that we do, so if you do a night dive or a dawn dive a bit before like daylight, you actually see these corals. The corals that you see during the day that look like they're dead, but they're actually not dead, or like they're not like moving or anything like that. But in the night and during dawn dives, you see these tentacles coming up, and they're feeding, and it's so fascinating to like watch them.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because I think corals are diurnal, which means that they like have two, not alive, but like active periods during the day, and it's usually dusk and dawn when there is no light. So really, like if you're then thinking about it, like when you go and dive, you see these incredible, beautiful ecosystems, but you really have only seen a fraction of what it actually looks like unless you go on a
and there are so many nocturnal animals that come out.
Most, I think, animals are nocturnal underwater, so which is pretty cool. But yeah, so corals are cool, and we in Sri Lanka, I think we do have quite a lot of corals across the island, and like I know that the corals in Sri Lanka come in like different types depending on what the substrate is. So when people speak about corals, they usually talking about the coralligenous when people usually speak about reefs, and we have reefs all around Sri Lanka, they're usually talking about coral reefs, which is the coralligenous reefs. But then we also have things like sandstone reefs and rock reefs. And really the only difference is the initial form of substrate that forms the reef system, right? And what we do know in Sri Lanka is that we do have a number of marine protected areas, and usually marine protected areas work to protect important ecosystems. So we've spoken about like MPAs and mangrove ecosystems, so it's nice that we're now having this conversation about MPAs
in a different form
and in coral reef ecosystems. So do you want to share with us a little bit about what you know about MPAs in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so as far as I know, I think there's about 29 marine protected areas, but they are obviously categorized into different parts. So they're categorized into national parks, then marine sanctuaries with marine components, wildlife parks with marine components in it, then there are marine sanctuaries, and there are nature reserves. So some of the national parks would be like Pigeon Island, Hikkaduwa, and then the marine sanctuaries are like Kayankerni and Rumasala and
the nature reserves would be like with the Taltevu nature reserve. And I think the national parks that have marine components are Yala, Bundala, Kubana. But I think those look a little bit more into coastal ecosystems as opposed to coral reef ecosystems itself.
I think it would be interesting to speak to our guest about like marine protected areas as well, because he has a lot of knowledge in that aspect as well.
And sort of recognizing that what is an MPA really, a marine protected area, it is a tool to be able to achieve some form of like, it doesn't necessarily always have to be conservation, but it like to achieve some sort of like a outcome, right? It's like a concentrated way of managing a space, even if it is for like fishery zones, or like, you know, when we spoke to Professor Turney about the marine spatial plan, essentially all of that was looking into doing some sort of zonation of the marine ecosystem, which then like, you know, involves some level of different managements, which then sort of builds into how we do our conservation and how we divide the ocean for the different uses that we have for it.
And how important it is for conservation as well in the end.
Because like at the end of the day, like if you have like a really important like breeding area or like a really pristine reef ecosystem that you don't really want damaged, then leaving it open for all kinds of uses, and not just fishing, right? Like fishing is one aspect, but like all kinds of uses, like even for recreational uses or like for ship traffic, then you're increasing the potential threats that these ecosystems would have to deal with. So in a way, it's just legislating what can and cannot be done in a specific area to achieve a specific outcome.
And to be honest, like we have a long way to go when it comes to like protecting our marine protected areas, and also like managing them and understanding how it benefits different types of people in different communities, from like marine tourism to actual livelihoods and fishing communities and things like that. So it would be interesting to bring this topic up.
And also on how we actually declare marine protected areas in the country, and what is the maybe the science or what is the thought processes behind it, and like making sure that, you know, it's done with intention, it's done in a data driven manner that is meant to be beneficial, as opposed to like just being this restrictive sort of excluding factor, right? But yeah, so I think these are really great conversations we can have with our guests.
And I'm going to interrupt you there. Speaking of like national parks, like the national parks that everyone knows about is like Pigeon Island and Hikkaduwa National Park and Reef and coral reefs or national parks like that. But actually there are so many, like I mean, just as I mentioned, there were like 29 marine protected areas. And also how like there are coral reefs in Colombo that no one is aware of. They are obviously in deeper waters, which is also I think a good thing, so that it's way more protected in a way compared to like these places that are accessible to like people or the public. But coming to that as well, Kayankerni is a marine park, or not a marine park, it's a marine sanctuary, yes. So it's a marine sanctuary that you have worked at, and also it was through Blue Resources Trust, who is a co-founder of the guest who we're bringing is also the co-founder of Blue Resources Trust. So tell us a bit about your experience working with him and I mean, we spoke about this in the first episode about Kayankerni and your thesis, but yeah.
Yeah, I think saying I worked in Kayankerni is a little bit of a overstatement. I did do some research there over a span of like 2 weeks at most, especially I think when talking about people who have worked in Kayankerni, right? Like the guest we have today who's been there, working there for so many years, for I think about 10 years. So in comparison to that, like I wouldn't say I worked there, but
it's still a bit.
It was, yeah, it was a place that I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to sort of engage with, and I was really grateful to be able to work under him. He was a really great mentor, and like you could like just from very simple conversation that you'll obviously see when we talk more on the episode, he's very well rounded in how he approaches science, how he approaches community aspects, how he approaches conservation, education, awareness, really all of it. And it was really great to be able to learn from someone like that, and to also have these conversations while I was I still am at a very early stage in my career, but while I was in that stage of thinking about what I want my conservation journey to look like. So really it was a really great experience, and like I've said before, Kayankerni was so beautiful that honestly it just made it like all the hard work of having to count a gazillion fish like really worthwhile. But I think we can just like move on and have our guests come in and talk a little bit more, because he really does have so much value and insight to share with everyone over here.
Yeah. Shout out to Pass It On for sponsoring this episode.
And now we're back. Hi everyone. On today's episode we have joining with us Nishan Perera, who's a marine biologist that has been working in coral reef conservation in Sri Lanka over the last few years. Thank you so much for joining us, Nishan, on today's episode.
Yeah, thank you so much again. And obviously, I'll ask you the first question about how you started your journey in into marine biology and coral reef conservation.
I think it would start with a connection to nature and the ocean, really. I think I was very lucky to grow up with parents who kind of encourage both a sense of curiosity and introduce me to nature. My dad was also a sailor in the merchant marine, so I also grew up in my early years a lot around the ocean. So I was always exposed to the ocean and nature, and I always had this kind of interest about nature, marine life. I was also, it's a series of events also, I guess. I grew up in Mount Lavinia. I would go to the beach a lot, and going into my teenage years, kind of snorkeling off the shore, and then getting into diving. I was very lucky that my school had started a dive club at the St. Thomas's College Sabbatical Club, which kind of gave me an opportunity to learn scuba diving. And with that, as I got into my late teens, I kind of elevated this interest in conservation into more kind of looking at research and making this potentially, is there an opportunity for me to do this? In a very naive way, I would say, just like, it sounds like something cool to do. It's a little bit more complicated after that, but then it led to me kind of pursuing higher education in that, and then getting into opportunistically looking for work. A long time ago, this was starting in the mid-90s, and this is where I am today, doing this as a full-time career.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think from all the guests we speak to, everyone always talks about how like their childhood in nature is like really what leads them to work in conservation, which is like super interesting. I mean, it's also a known fact, but it's just nice to see that there's so much proof of this. So you talk about how you started, and now you've come here, which is you're actually the co-founder and one of the directors at Blue Resources Trust, which I believe is one of Sri Lanka's only marine research organizations. So can you tell us a little bit about what led you to starting BRT and what the sort of story behind starting it was?
I mean, I would reiterate that it's definitely one of the few, but certainly not the only. There are many others, not many, but there are others doing some very good work as well. BRT's story is also an interesting one. Daniel Fernando, who is the co-founder of BRT, and I actually met on a dive trip in the Maldives. I was leading the dive trip, and Daniel was a client of mine. And we were sitting on a boat in the Maldives in Atoll and talking about, he had just come back to Sri Lanka after doing a master's, and we were talking about both of us kind of sharing this dream of starting something in Sri Lanka, and we always had this passion to set up a field research center in Sri Lanka, not just to run kind of conservation projects, but something long term that would be a dedicated research facility. That's where the idea first took root. This was in 2010. And obviously we stayed in touch, we became friends, we started working together independently on small projects. And then in 2016, this kind of elevated into Blue Resources Trust. So interesting journey, but yeah, now we've been running for almost 9 years.
Wow. Yeah, so some of the research that you've done through Blue Resource Trust is very related to the research you've done in Kayankerni, and it's a magnificent coral reef system. Tell us about how you why you decided to do the research there and what it's looking like now.
It starts from actually Daniel and I doing an initial kind of reef exploration survey, reconnaissance visit, I think 2012. And I had since been to Kayankerni almost every year after that. I've had my fingers in a few different things, including running a dive shop, so we used to operate in the East Coast. And diving there, one of the things that struck me was that this reef was very healthy. It was very diverse in terms of the coral species and fish species. It was relatively intact and relatively unknown. Not completely unknown. There are other people who had done some initial research there, but not very well documented. There is no published material, really very little on it. And we also noticed that this reef seemed to bleach quite often, but it seemed to recover. Yeah. So in 2016, when there was a prediction for a global mass coral bleaching event, we actually went to Kayankerni before the bleaching started in order to get some baseline data to see, okay, we want to document this and see what happens. There was an American scientist who was here on a Fulbright scholarship. She was also talking to us, and we went together. We started documenting it, and that's kind of led to us then, since then, doing long-term research. So one of the focuses for us has been throughout our programs at BRT. So we have 3 programs. I run the Coral Reef program, Daniel runs the fisheries program, and we also have a seagrass and climate change program. We have been kind of focused on long-term data. Collecting long-term data is really important for us to understand trends. So we've tried to look at a place to locate. So it was just a coincidence that this was the place we set up, but it was very interesting, and then we built all other programs around that in that area as well. So that's how we started working there, and we've been able to then kind of understand the ecology of the reef, because to understand something you really need to see the changes through time as well.
Would you say Kayankerni as a reef system is quite resilient? So would you say it's because it's not as accessible to people?
It could be. Usually there are multiple factors, both anthropogenic and natural reasons, that can affect resilience. It certainly is less impacted by human impacts, but it certainly is impacted. There are impacts coming, for example, sediment and nutrient inflow from the Valacheni Lagoon. There is destructive illegal fishing going on in the area. So there are these factors, but it could also be the way local currents work as well. So you have your main ocean currents, and you have this kind of smaller currents systems in there. So part of our work has been to collect not just the coral reef data, but collect as much metadata or additional data on oceanography and stuff that we can. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to fit in as many pieces. We certainly don't have all the pieces to tell you what the picture is, but we're beginning to understand a few things now.
Yeah. I want to go off track a little bit. And so you spoke about how you used to run a dive shop, and you also spoke about, you used to run dive tours in the Maldives and such. Just wanted to see, do you think your experience as like a recreational dive operator has affected the way that you maybe carry out research or go diving, and sort of the way you engage with the ocean for your research in Kayankerni or anywhere else even?
I wouldn't say it's impacted my research, but it has given me a perspective of how other people engage with the marine environment. As a researcher, more than a researcher, kind of working in resource management and conservation, you do have to look at, how people, because when we do conservation or conservation management or resource management, we're not managing the reef or the seagrass meadow or the fish. We're managing how people interact with this habitat. And often we kind of look at the direct threats like fisheries and stuff. But then when we get into kind of messaging and talking to a wider public, you also want to look at other groups. And divers are this group of people who interact a lot with this resource in a non-extractive way. They're dependent on it recreationally. Their livelihood doesn't depend on it. Okay, dive shops do, but not the recreational divers. So kind of seeing that perspective has been interesting, or understanding that has been interesting. And when I have been engaged in the dive industry, kind of education and conservation has been a big part of that, and kind of storytelling through that. So it has influenced in some ways, but obviously research is a kind of separate sphere.
Yeah, well, that was really interesting. I think having that perspective also really is important, just to know how to then navigate situations with people that you are trying to manage when they interact with the ocean. But going back to Kayankerni, so you've been doing research there for 9 years now, you said, and it has undergone a lot of threats, but it also seems to be resilient. So has there been any change in the reef ecosystem that you have witnessed over the last years that you have been working there?
Large sections of the reef remain fairly similar to what I first saw, which is why it's an interesting reef, not without its impact. So this reef, like I said, I've seen it bleach. I know we have data from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 24. So there has been a lot of bleaching events, but mortality, or the number of corals that die, is relatively low. So we would classify it, at least at this stage, as a resilient reef, because that means either it's able to withstand the bleaching or recover from the bleaching fairly well. It has one section of the reef did die out in 2019, 18, 19. It was impacted by heavy algal overgrowth, algal infestation, and that area then also bleached whatever was left. So the algae kind of smothered the corals, and then whatever was left was bleached. So that area kind of got a double whammy, so to speak, and I think the stress was too much. So there was maybe 95% of the corals in that section of the reef did die, but we are seeing recovery now of corals coming back. So that's also interesting that it's bouncing back, and it's not the only reefs. Other reefs also showing resilience, some places no. So this is why it's also kind of this interesting laboratory to understand. There are things of oceanography. We're also interested in things like metabolomics and genetics to see whether there are certain strains in the coral or the symbiotic zooxanthellae that might be supporting resilience as well.
What are some of the species that are resilient in the reef?
So generally, the faster growing species like the acroporas, the branching acroporas, and even the tabulate acroporas tend to be more vulnerable to bleaching. That's usually the case even on land. Grass grows fast and dies fast. Here though, we have seen them kind of do better, but they do bleach. We have seen them very heavily bleached. This reef also has a lot of old Porites domes, mostly Porites lutea and Porites lobata. Those are quite old. Actually, if you see some of those, they're about 5 meters across. So you're talking of 500-600-year-old colonies. Porites generally does better with bleaching. There is a Montipora in Sri Lanka. We've known that it doesn't even bleach. So even when the other corals are bleached, this doesn't bleach. So
that's interesting.
What's interesting is it has less of these what I call single species or monospecific stands. When you go to a place like Pigeon Island, it's beautiful with lots of corals, but in large areas, it's the same species. Here you will have patches where it's the same species, but never of that scale. You will always have a lot of variation, which generally is a good thing.
Yeah.
So it has higher species richness, or
Not
is it just
total.
the distribution?
Pigeon Island also does. Trincomalee reefs also do have, but you would say like 80% of the coral is one
One
species.
species.
Or two, maybe not one, okay, 2 or 3 species. Whereas here you don't have one dominating so much.
Yeah.
Different sections of the reef have different kind
So
of
species
composition.
evenness is a lot better in Kayankerni.
And the structure is also different. So we have our sampling points where some sections are kind of spur and groove formation, some places have these porous domes, some places are flat, different. So, and the coral composition changes a lot.
Right. And moving a little bit away from corals, you actually do a lot of research on reef fish as well. Actually, I think that might be your main area of
Yeah, I'm more a
expertise,
fish
if I'm not
ecologist than a
Yeah.
coral scientist.
Has the fish population changed, or like have you seen any impacts
You
on
would
that
know,
front?
right, Mehak?
No, I
Didn't you do your thesis on it?
Yes, Mehak did, since you did your master's research work
I didn't look
at
at
Kayankerni.
She
I
asked
didn't
me
look-
to count the fish as well.
I didn't look at temporally.
Yes, unfortunately, we do see a decline of some of the targeted food species. Some of the groupers and snappers in some areas seem to be preliminary data indicates they're going. So this is an indicator of fishing pressure. And in the sections that have hard mortality, you also see things like butterfly fish disappear because they're dependent on corals and they feed on corals. So obviously when their food source goes, they disappear. So those are the groups that we've seen a big decline.
That's why it was so hard for me to count it. But yeah, I think we can move a little bit away from Kayankerni now. So you're currently working on a project in Colombo mapping the urban reefs. So I don't think a lot of people know that Sri Lanka, Colombo actually has reefs just off its coast. So could you talk to us a little bit about those reefs and like why they're important and like what makes them so unique?
Yeah, I always find it surprising that people don't think that there is anything off Colombo because we have wildlife and really interesting wetlands within the urban setting here. So reefs don't grow because of the city came after the reefs. What you could have is because of the city, these natural ecosystems degrading.
Yeah.
So, and that has also happened in Colombo. So Colombo, like the rest of Sri Lanka's coast, has reefs. Sri Lanka is surrounded by reefs along most of its coastline. They're primarily sandstone-based reefs. They're kind of ridges running parallel to the shore. But there are also these offshore patch reefs, which are coral reefs. So these are probably reefs that were shallower when sea levels were lower. So they were more near shore or coastal patch reefs. Now sea levels have risen, they're further offshore. They are between 8 to 16, 17 kilometers offshore. And they're a little bit deeper at about 20 to 30, 35 meters. These reefs are quite interesting. The reefs that are very close to the shore, unfortunately, have been very badly impacted by pollution primarily. Like everywhere else, all reefs in Sri Lanka are impacted by overfishing or destructive fishing. So certain fish groups that were more common, like large groupers and stuff, have been fished out. But when you get to the offshore reefs, you actually have quite good coral cover, 20 to 30% live coral cover. The water is actually very clear when you get offshore. Inshore is very murky, but when you get offshore, you have much clearer water than in some of the more popular diving destinations in Sri Lanka. So these reefs haven't been documented very well. They're not unknown to science. People at NARA have done science. People like Arjun Rajasuri have done a lot of work, particularly in the 1990s. That's how I was first introduced. I used to work a lot with Arjun at the time. So there is some data, but there hasn't been any kind of comprehensive effort to map the biodiversity, the areas, and really document that well. It's tougher also because they're deeper. So diving on these deeper reefs is more complicated to do science. And because of that, they're completely ignored in management as well. We're always focused about the reefs that we know, because also, if you look at Sri Lanka's marine protected areas, they are quite biased towards coral reefs, but they're all shallow coral reefs.
Yeah.
They're the ones that people all go to and the
Yeah.
public know. It's not always driven by data, it's driven by public opinion, which is not necessarily a bad thing, that there's a conservation push, but it's not always balanced. So these reefs are intent here to do very preliminary kind of biodiversity mapping of 5 reef systems, representative reef systems of Colombo. There are many more areas that we can't cover. So it's a relatively small project to kind of initially document this and then look at what the needs are in terms of management, elevate this data to relevant management agencies, and then look at building something bigger to conserve these habitats as well. One of the big threats for these, apart from pollution, is actually anchoring of commercial ships. There's a lot of ships waiting to go into harbor, and these reefs are not designated as no anchoring zone, so it's not the fault of anyone, it's just that they haven't been marked. But even when we're doing our surveys, you can find these ship anchors have dragged through these, and these are not like small boat anchors, it's literally like a bulldozer going through the reef. So yeah, so hopefully we can kind of document these, map these, identify these, and kind of look at a spatial management plan to manage this better.
Interesting. Also, you're not just a researcher or a conservationist, you are also an underwater photographer and a writer. So tell us a bit about how you use those avenues to bring awareness to conservation and bring awareness to the marine field in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an amateur hobbyist for photography. I mean, I try to use that as a way of conservation storytelling and do conservation. Part of my photography comes from scientific photography. So when we are working on research, we do scientific photography. Then how can I use the imagery and my knowledge and my experiences to tell stories? I wouldn't say that it's something that I do very seriously. I'm
It's your hobby.
But you have a book, no?
Yeah, I do. I mean,
Yeah, Coral Reefs of Sri Lanka.
so I do. But when I can find the time and I can motivate myself to post something on social media, which is not very often, I do try to. But more than kind of social media and books, I try to use it when I do talks as well.
Yeah.
To kind of use imagery, because I think there is this gap between science and kind of the conservation awareness group.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't blame either side for it, because people are focused on what they do and they have different skill sets. The scientists generally keep preaching to their audience, so they're driven, particularly in academia. And I consciously decided that academia is not where I want to be, because you're driven more about publications, but scientific publications. Not that we don't like that and we don't do that. I certainly try to publish. It's an important part of science. But that is not the only thing, because it's not only about a conference presentation and how many papers you publish, it's also about trying to get a message across. And then how can I use reasonably decent photography to kind of tell these stories and add that value, because there are also a lot of people who are trying to do awareness, which I really value, but sometimes there's a little bit of a lack of some of the technical insight or the knowledge, or they need to go and source that knowledge. So if you have a little bit of both, then you should try to do that, and of course support others who are doing that as well.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, and like very few people, like you said, have that intersection, and it's nice that you have academia, research, like photography, writing, all of that, but also you do a lot of work as part of your research is, like you said, managing people. So MPA management, or marine protected areas management, is a large part of it, right? So what are some of the opportunities or challenges that you see in Sri Lanka with regards to our marine protected areas and how they're managed and conserved?
The challenge I would start with first is that Sri Lanka has a high population density and a big fishery. So there isn't a square inch of the ocean in Sri Lanka that is not fished. So traditional marine protected areas, or MPAs, that are, say, no-take zones where you have zero fishing, are really difficult to do in Sri Lanka. You know, places like Pigeon Island, the core area of Pigeon Island, yes, now there's technically no fishing, and it's definitely very little. There may be very small areas, but we can't set aside these large no-take zones in Sri Lanka. It's not viable. What we need to use MPAs for is kind of focusing management efforts. So MPAs are really a tool to focus your management effort into a smaller area, relatively small area. We have all these regulations, but policing the ocean is an impossible task for any country, not just Sri Lanka. So the point of an MPA should be to identify critical habitats for whatever purpose. They are important species, foraging grounds or breeding grounds or coral reefs, sea grasses, whatever it is, and or migratory pathways, and then protect those as core zones, and you concentrate your management efforts in surveillance and enforcement into that, and you work with people who use those resources to kind of look at more sustainable practices and regulate fishery. As a start, you start enforcing the things that are already legal. So there is no debate on this. There is no debate going on in Sri Lanka whether dynamite fishing should be allowed or not. It's an overwhelming consensus. It's illegal and everyone agrees, except for a very small fraction of people who do it, who also agree it's not a good thing, but they do it for profit. There's no debate about this. So I think we have to start with that, and this leads to that opportunity, right? I think sometimes we try to get ahead of ourselves, and this I would be critical of how we do MPAs here, is that we are focused on declaring before doing something. We need to set up functional systems for the MPAs we have now before we just go and declare. There's also a sense amongst certain people that, oh, we should just declare it now because, okay, we'll figure out the management later. Well, we haven't figured out the management for the ones we declared starting from Hikadu in 1979. So
now look at
it's a while, right? So I think if we couldn't do it all this time, there's something wrong, and we need to change what we're doing and fix that. The other problem of declaring and not doing something is it devalues the concept of an MPA. So now we have MPAs that are paper parks. People do whatever they want to do because we don't have the resources to manage them. And then the idea of an MPA is lost. So then people also, even the fishing communities, think that an MPA, we can go and do whatever we want. So it's not a barrier to anything. The only people who ask for permission to work in MPAs are scientists, nobody else, right? So this is a problem. Over a long time, it's a shifting baseline. What is an MPA? It's just this place, and we maybe do a bit of tourism. So I think we have to change that. And the second thing is that there are, if you're looking at opportunities, so many MPAs in other countries similar to Sri Lanka. We shouldn't look at countries like Australia or the US. We should look at other developing countries who have very similar problems to us. There are people just above or below the poverty line who are directly dependent on these resources. Their state agencies are woefully under-resourced. They have all the challenges we have, but they have looked at solutions, whether it's co-management, working with private sector, various solutions to fix this. So Sri Lanka needs to open up and think a little bit differently, and it's small changes we need to do. And I think with those small changes, we will start seeing differences and impacts. And once we do that, we have a kind of functional model. If we get one place working, we can copy paste that to the other places. Not copy paste what's done in Indonesia or Philippines. We look at their model, see the concept, fine tune it for Sri Lanka, but keeping the concept alive, and then build a model for Sri Lanka and then roll it out.
I was just going to ask you, so you've dived in different parts of the world as well, and like places like Rajampat, which are big marine protected areas, and they even take like marine park tickets from like recreational divers. Tell us a bit about what the difference you see with countries like that and how we could maybe
strive to achieve.
I think the biggest difference in those countries is the concept of co-management. We have heard this concept talked about in Sri Lanka for the last 30 years, or at least every time I've been in marine science, which is also almost 30 years. But we don't really do co-management. We consult communities at an initial level, but we don't engage local stakeholders or resource users as active participants in the management process. So they have no ownership. The management is still left to the government agencies because we have a very hierarchical top-down approach. And these agencies have their own challenges. Now, I'm not here to kind of point fingers at government departments saying they're not doing their job. If they're not doing their job, they're not doing it because they have real world problems. They don't have the resources they have. And we can go on about them not having it, but the government is not going to give them those resources. And Sri Lanka is just coming out of bankruptcy. So the first thing that you cut when the economy is not doing well is environment. So it's difficult. We are not going to cut healthcare and support national parks. So
That
resources
would
are
be a great
never resources are never going to take a big part of your budget, right? Everywhere else in developing world, we have looked at private sector engagement, financing models that help sustain this and engage local players, and they even do joint enforcement kind of monitoring. So you would, for example, you would have a kind of a management ranger patrol team that would have, say, marine park authorities, kind of similar to our DWC, a Coast Guard or Navy agents, as well as community rangers, who all work together. For example, if there's a marine park patrol vessel, they will have at least one of every component on that. And that gives more legitimacy, more ownership. The community knows what is going. They are reporting back. There's transparency in the process of where the funds are going. So this leads to more kind of engagement of people, because people start trusting the process. Right now in Sri Lanka, the communities don't trust the process, because even when people want to do something right, they don't trust it and they feel frustrated. So we need to build that trust, and we have to engage them to be. If I was doing something and telling you but not telling you everything, then you're not going to trust me. So we need to build trust with people, and use the local community as your ally and not your enemy. I think then we can progress.
And they'll also protect it like it's theirs then.
100%. I mean, because here we don't have the concept of local ownership.
Yeah.
Whereas in all these other countries, there is a stewardship, ownership, and they're part of that. That's why I said they are part of that management team.
Yeah.
So they can see action. So if someone is coming and dynamiting the reef in front of your village where you fish, you are part of that response team that takes action.
Yeah.
So you have ownership, right? You don't do it alone. No, even in places like Rajampat, you don't have the villagers going and arresting people. Arresting is done by other people, government officials. But they're part of that process, and it's transparent. Whereas in Sri Lanka, they can only report it to an authority, and action is often low or lacking because of these resource constraints. So then their point is, why are we bothering with this? Let's us dynamite as well before the other person dynamites. So it's a cascading system of problems.
I think actually digging a little bit deeper into that, it's also the fact that communities don't really benefit from being in the vicinity of an MPA, or actually benefit from the MPA directly itself, right? Unless they're one of the few people that are tour operators, which also I think a lot of the times isn't usually locals. They're mostly like people from like Colombo or something along those lines. And with the way that the financial system in Sri Lanka is set up, with the fact that all of the income from MPAs or any kind of national park goes into national treasury, there's actually no incentive for an MPA, even like Pigeon Island, to do any better, or there's no incentive for people like the community to protect the park, especially given the fact that sometimes with like things like the no-take zones, it becomes very exclusionary, where they actually lose access, or they lose like traditional rights over what they were using that space for when it becomes an MPA. So then what is their incentive to respect it,
No,
right?
I agree.
What is their incentive?
Totally,
to
and in other places, it's a variety of income sources that set up, you could look at different models. Often they set up a conservation trust fund there.
That's the easiest.
And you will have, say, a portion of your park entry fees, plus there are other sources of income. Hotels often pay an environmental tax. And it's not a lot. It's viable to do in Sri Lanka. It's like a $1 per room night from all the hotels, which
like
is
payment for ecosystem services.
quite easy to do. There are other, kind of impact investments. So you kind of promote private sector investment into, industrial profitable ventures that are more sustainable and support kind of local industry. And you bring in investment, and this leads to kind of positive impacts for the community. And these trust funds even have components of money that are for community welfare, and they work together with the hoteliers, other people, so that part of that money goes to support the local school, a local health clinic. So it's not even at an individual, it's not giving money to every individual, but the community benefits. And I can tell you from my work, when we work with local communities, one of the things they're always looking for is investment in their children. it's very clear. If they always tell us that they want their children to have a better future, I think that's not unique to those communities. That's what our parents had as well in their minds, right? So when they see these benefits, not just directly for them to have money in their hand, but their families, their children benefiting, they have a doctor who visits, and there's eye clinic once a month, or whatever these things are, then they see this money is coming from this, but it has to be also tied with certain compromises that they have to make. That distinction is very important. So here is where sometimes Sri Lanka takes concepts and doesn't do it right. We take this idea of community welfare, so when you have a project, it's not a sustainable mechanism, but let's say we have a 3-year project funded by a donor. We take a part of that money and we go and do some beneficial things for the community. We support them with some capital investment, some equipment for livelihoods, etc. But that's it's short term. It's only for that time of the project, and then that dies. Most often things you build often break and there's nothing to maintain. Secondly, it's not tied with their conservation actions. It has to be, okay, let's work together. You don't impose, you work together with people and try and figure out, come to a consensus, okay, let's agree to not use this particular fishing method because it's destructive. Yeah. If you agree to this, then we go. Then there is a monitoring, and this is tied to this. And you will find that over time, people start seeing the benefits and their fisheries also improve. Fish stocks recover as well, and there's spillover from these NPAs and fisheries. And this is proven over decades of research in other countries. So it's not rocket science, and I don't think it's not easy to do. You can't walk in and change it overnight, but it's not as complicated as people might make it sound to be.
I think we can start wrapping up now. There was a lot of information there, and like a lot for us to also sit with and think once again of conservation from beyond just the science and the data, but as sort of like all the different intersecting layers that it really is.
And how awareness is important as well.
So what is one message that you wish more people in Sri Lanka knew about coral reefs?
I think people need to realize, not just with coral reef, but with nature in general, and coral reefs particularly because people are not so aware that they even exist around Sri Lanka, other than in Hikadu or Pigeon Island. There are coral reefs even in Colombo, as you heard. Is what ecosystem services they play in our daily lives, right? So the fish we eat, this is a country that consumes a lot of fish, or 2/3 of animal protein is from fish. A lot of that is from coastal fisheries that are dependent on reefs. So we are talking of a collapse of these fisheries. Everyone wants to have cheaper fish, but we don't want to protect where the fish comes from. That's a simple example, but our lives are always connected to some ecosystem or species in ways that we don't understand. Coral reefs are not only important for the people who fish there and the people who dive there. And they're much more widespread and have a large impact than us. No, they're not just tiny places like Hikadu or Pigeon Island that you can go and snorkel.
That's actually really like an interesting message to leave, because it also shows how reliant like even the everyday person is on coral reefs in Sri Lanka, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah. So to lighten the conversation a bit, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. What's your favorite coral species?
Probably Porites lutea.
Okay, what does it look like?
It looks like a big rock. It's one of these. It's a very slow growing dome type coral. And when you this, for me, I am also very interested in geology and rocks. And this is a living rock essentially, but it's a live animal, right? These domes, like the ones we have in Kayankerni, like I said, 500-600 years old. So that was a small colony when the Portuguese arrived in Sri Lanka.
Wow.
That coral has experienced a lot more than we can ever imagine. For me, every time I'm there, I'm thinking of what amazing things have happened around that reef. And as a reef ecologist, what changes we have had. Because we also, as scientists, we look at these changes that we see, right? Or even as people. But changes happen over vast geological timescales that we can't comprehend. So it's still a small time geologically, but a little more than what we will ever see.
And I actually think that's a great place.
Wait, what's your favorite coral reef system in Sri Lanka?
I mean, I'm biased towards Kayankerni because I know that reef best.
Oh, I thought the Colombo reef.
Yeah, the Colombo reefs,
They're your passion
The Reefs,
project.
they're my passion project.
Yeah.
Because Colombo, Mount Lavinia was where I grew up. Colombo is
Yeah.
my home, and they're even less understood. But now I work so much in Kayankerni, and I have kind of built a second home around Kayankerni. We've got to know these individual corals very well that we have tagged and we monitor. So I think I have a connection to it.
Okay, and last question.
Please,
What's your
fish.
favorite dive destination?
Raja Ampat in Indonesia.
Okay.
As an ecologist, it has less sharks than some other places, but for diversity, which for me as a scientist, it is the best place.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Now we can end.
So to end, maybe you could also leave with a message of hope for our listeners on like the future of coral reef / marine conservation in Sri Lanka.
I would say that even for us, and actually sometimes more so for us as scientists who work in it and understand the issues somewhat deeply, it can be very kind of
Overwhelming.
yeah, kind of almost have a negativity around it. It's overwhelming. But then it's also when you take stock of things, you realize that first of all, these things, we are still talking of small time scales. Things do recover and come back, but things have to change. So I will take one example of where humanity has had a positive change. I don't know whether you guys remember the ozone crisis in the 90s, right? So this was the biggest thing, not the climate change issue now, but it was the ozone hole.
Yeah.
And everyone was worried of skin cancer and other issues, and we've solved that. The world came together and solved that. We changed what we use in refrigerators, in our hairsprays, and everything, and we fixed it. It's pretty much a done deal. So climate change can be fixed. We are going through a phase where either it's too expensive, or people are reluctant, or there's lobbying from certain industries, or some people are in denial. I mean, those people, I don't, let's not go there, because it's a fact. I will say this, it's a fact, right? Climate change is a fact, and humans are influencing and accelerating it. But I believe that technology will come to a point, whether we like it or not, and however much the oil industry and others will try to stop this, it's just the way humans have been, right? We've always kind of evolved to find more efficient ways, and we are going to find better ways of powering our planet. And I think greenhouse gases will go down, even if it's not by policy, by default, because that's the more efficient way of doing it. We will lose some between now and then. I think we're going to see a cycle of decline, but things will recover, and the planet is resilient. We are not going to save the planet. The planet will go on even after we are done. So
Definitely.
it will recover.
And that's such a great message.
Yeah.
And obviously every little impact matters. So yeah.
And a really nice note to end on now. So thank you so much, Nishan, for joining us and sharing everything from like your so many years of experience. And thank you everybody else for tuning in. We hope it was interesting.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast is a CreatorCast production.